Welcome to Subject to Power. I'm El Kamihira. I'm a documentary producer and writer, and on this show, I have in-depth conversations with people from science, law, economy, culture, history, philosophy, etc., from all around the world about the various means and, in particular, the systems of power that shape women's lives. Some episodes take a long view or a zoomed out view. Some conversations get really granular and focuses on very specific subjects or individual stories. And with these interviews, I try to chart a map of sorts of the both visible and invisible forces we live with that influences our everyday lives, the decisions we make, the choices we have or don't have, and the challenges we face. Each of my guests on Subject to Power, whatever field they're in, are in the business of cracking reality open in some way, of critically scrutinizing and seriously questioning what we know and how we know it, to examine conventions and social norms that may have been normalized or that have become tradition or just part of our accepted reality. Our world moves super fast, and we're all struggling to sort of sort through the enormous amount of information coming at us every day. So I look at these conversations as a way to slow down and contemplate different points of view. So many developments in our culture, especially scientific and technological advancements, are sold to us as progress, as positive steps into the future, and also as kind of an inevitable natural progression. And with that, many of us tune out our critical thinking and just kind of accept the terms we're being given. And nowhere is this as true as in the area of fertility, pregnancy, and birth, which is ironically a woman's world by nature, but it's also an extremely male-dominated world. It's also a world that has exploded with scientific and technological advancements that has given us unprecedented entry into women's wombs and never before abilities to manipulate and exploit women's life-creating capacities. As a new mom, my guest on this episode, Lexi Ellingsworth, found herself interested in the subject of surrogacy, and in particular, the laws that govern surrogacy in the UK. And the more she read and discovered about the actual lived experiences of surrogate mothers, the more she started to question the ethics of what she saw. And in 2019, she founded Stop Surrogacy Now, UK. In this episode, we talk about Lexi's journey into the global surrogacy industry, what it looks like in different parts of the world, what drives baby buying, and what motivates women to become surrogate mothers. And of course, the mountains of ethical questions that the practice of surrogacy raises. We can just dive right in. I have a sheet of notes and thoughts, and
yeah, just go ahead and ask me, and I'll answer the best I can.
Yeah. So, how did you become interested and start campaigning and being active against surrogacy? Like, what prompted it?
So, originally in 2019. The Law Commission of England and Wales and the Scottish Law Commission joined together to have a project on surrogacy. And I believe they were lobbied by surrogacy agencies to look at the law and to reform the law. And they did a public consultation, and this was talked about on Mumsnet, a very popular parenting forum. And I was on there, and I learnt what the proposals contained and was obviously learning about surrogacy. It hadn't been something that was on my radar before. And as a new mum, I wanted to just explore it and learn what the situation was. And when I realised what the proposals were, because obviously you can tell from what the consultation says, I was just absolutely appalled. And I thought, this is really dangerous. There were already organisations in the UK and international organisations who were campaigning against surrogacy, and I was obviously learning about them and what they had been doing as well. There were no single issue surrogacy groups in the UK that were looking at law reform. So I basically decided to, fairly reluctantly at the beginning, because I've had a career in non-profit campaigning and it's really hard going. Like it's tough. We don't have any funding. We don't receive funding from any government sources or international sources or anything like that. It's all completely self-funded. And it's a lot of hard work. So we launched in 2019 and sort of like more officially in 2020. This year is basically my 7th year campaigning. Wow. I didn't think it would necessarily be what I was doing at this time in my life, but it is what I've chosen. And the Law Commission, I did a Freedom of Information request to find out more about the proposals and the people who were working at the Law Commission on the surrogacy project. And that I still have. That was ultimately, it kind of drove me to really investigate further and then to launch an official campaign against surrogacy reform in the UK, and it's grown from there.
Yeah, and your organization is very clearly titled.
Yeah, Stop Surrogacy Now UK. So there is another organisation called Stop Surrogacy Now in the States, and we work alongside them, but we're not connected in any formal way. There are other campaigns as well. So Surrogacy Concern is a UK campaign that joined the fight really in 2023, which was when the Law Commission, they published their report, what they call the core report, and they had a draft bill as well, which was a little bit unusual. And that period of work has come to an end, and that's all concluded with the Law Commission. But we are still campaigning against those law reform proposals coming forward. And then we're involved in some international work now as well.
If you had to summarize your concrete missions, how would you summarize?
So we have sort of like different pillars of things that we include as elements, if you like, of our campaign. But overall, the goal is to ban surrogacy globally.
Period.
I'm not unequivocal about it. I don't discriminate. I'm not saying that some people can do it and some people can't. I'm saying it should not happen. It's not ethical. It's not safe. And in every surrogacy arrangement, a newborn baby is removed from their mother at birth. And obviously, as a newborn baby, that is the only home they've ever had, will ever know, like as a newborn. And the widely known evidence of babies understanding their mother's heartbeat, her voice, even tasting her diet, obviously, when they're in utero, they understand her gait and her movement. There's just no way really of diluting it. I think people try, but there's no way for it to be made safe or ethical, in my view. So it just shouldn't happen.
Yeah, there are so many aspects to the morality of it or the amorality of it. And I'd like to get into some of that. But I wanted to also, I know that through this work, you actually come into contact with quite a lot of women who have gone through the surrogacy process. In fact, I attended a panel at Philia this past October with some of those women telling their stories. And I think every person who thinks about surrogacy should listen to a handful of stories. You know, it's like with everything. You don't understand it until you hear the actual real application of it. So can you talk a little bit about the women that you've come into contact with and some of those stories?
Yes, of course. So the women who spoke at Philia last year also spoke at the Senate in France, and they were just incredible, powerful testimony from 4 women, and they were from around the world. We worked in connection with the International Coalition Against Surrogate Motherhood on those events, and the women who spoke, so their stories are actually, they're both on YouTube and available on my blog page, because the speeches are shared there for people to go and read that testimony themselves. But it was the atmosphere, particularly at the Senate, you could have cut it with a knife, So the first woman who spoke, we call her Clara. She's not able to give her real name. She has ongoing legal action, a couple of court cases. And for Clara, she was speaking for the first time. And they were very, very brave women to share their stories, their personal feelings, their emotions, and to share it in that capacity. When survivors share their stories, they are, to a degree, sometimes to a large degree, reliving that experience. And later that year, last year, I went to the European Parliament, and Reem Al Salem spoke of how we need to consider these women as victims of surrogacy. And I support that statement. And I think that we should always consider these women as survivors of surrogacy, much in the way that we would talk about surviving prostitution or surviving child abuse or surviving human trafficking. They're very, very serious. I mean, I would say it was crime.
Yeah.
In many places around the world, it is a crime. And we do need to think of it in those terms, because the exploitation of women and the commodification of their bodies, and subsequently of the children born that way as well, this is what surrogacy actually is. And I think that's how we need to shift the conversation. And I think that's where it's going now, if I'm honest. And it takes those brave women, women like that, to speak up. And actually, there are women who can't speak. So whether that's as a result of signing a non-disclosure agreement, whether that's because they've been through the court process and the judge makes a ruling that they cannot speak publicly, they may have been put under pressure to delete social media accounts, to not speak of this again. Essentially, there was a woman who did not join that panel. And we speak with her, we're very close with her, and she explained that she was in a Facebook forum group, connected to a surrogacy agency here in the UK. And because she was expressing some doubts during her pregnancy. And so she was roundly told off, if you like, by the people in that group, and then ejected from that group. So that the support network that she thought she had from other surrogate mothers, women who were going through the same process, agency workers, and that was sort of like her community, if you like, who understood surrogacy, because not everybody does. And she was then roundly ejected because she didn't stick to the script. So there are women out there who can't speak, and we're very lucky that these women who spoke at Filia were able to.
And these were women who have undertaken surrogacy, the altruistic, quote unquote, version, right? In this country, we have commercial surrogacy, but in the UK, that's not legal.
Yes. So it's sort of like what happens in reality and what is the legal status. They are different things. But there was a woman on both panels at the Senate in Paris and in Brighton who had undergone commercial surrogacy as well. It's quite a complex case, but ultimately she had gone through the surrogacy contract and arrangement for who she believed to be an Asian couple in America, but actually the baby was intended, if you like, for an Asian man in the UK. And it was between the couple in America and this man in the UK. They had made their own arrangement, and the child was actually moved across borders with a nanny. And upon the arrival, that child was taken into care and made a ward of court. And so the court case that followed involved her, obviously, because she is the birth mother. And under UK law, as it stands now, the surrogate mother needs to sign a form to give her written consent that she relinquishes her parental rights. And in the case of this woman, she didn't want to actually.
Once she discovered the true identity.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I don't think that she necessarily even wanted to do it when it was the situation that she understood to be true, but certainly when she knew what the reality was and what the truth was, she absolutely did not give her consent to this man. And it ended up being an adoption arrangement because they had fallen outside of the criteria for surrogacy at that point. And it's actually a really shocking case because she wrote to the judge basically begging for him not to give the child to this man. He was the genetic father. He had a genetic relationship, which is required under surrogacy law.
Mm.
And that didn't go anywhere. I mean, it wasn't really listened to. And so she had no
recourse.
She had no recourse. She had no legal recourse to do anything, really. And her story is very powerful. Yeah. So there was a commercial arrangement there in those stories. And yes, you're right. The altruistic surrogacy in the UK is not altruistic because lots of money changes hands, and we feel strongly that there's a financial incentive through various means. This can occur with the surrogacy agencies who have financial incentives under their membership program. So, for example, vouchers, days out. In your expenses, you can have takeaways and different massage treatments. There's a sort of limit on the expenses under reform, trying to control them. But to be honest, it's more of a rebranding, like a recategorization. So gifts are still allowed. They call them modest gifts, but what's a modest gift? Like a modest gift to a very wealthy person might be a car, or it might be a necklace. It could be a range of things, and there's no upper limit. There's no cap. And the sort of financial incentivization, it's unusual for a woman who is wealthier to do this for someone who is poorer than herself, so who has low income household. It's, as we see, more likely to be women who you can have middle income households, and some people go to great lengths to get the money together for a surrogacy arrangement and for IVF treatment. So where it was, I would say, like with the elite, with the sort of celebrities, it's now filtering down and has been filtering down, I think, for some time into sort of like the middle classes and middle income. It's quite popular within the media. So it remains altruistic in law, but in practice, it's thousands and thousands of pounds. I mean, one agency in the UK actually suggests a sort of flat rate amount of £35,000. And we've had a couple of cases not so long ago going up to about £60,000. And in the UK, we obviously have the NHS. So we're not having the costs that you would see in the US of actually giving birth. Like, I understand, having seen examples, these are enormous amounts of money that you would pay to have, for example, a hospital stay or pain relief. And then there's obviously for a C-section, that's even more money. We just don't have that here. So the amounts of money and how it's determined and what is paid for, and childcare would be included. You could have a gardener included because you might not be able to physically work in your garden, or clean your house.
So many ways.
Other women get when they're pregnant. So it's not like it's actually paying for a service. Otherwise, we really do have to think about what we are talking about here.
Yeah. Now, when I was listening to these women, it was very clear to me that they really had a very fantasy notion of what surrogacy was, and came to discover just a vastly different situation, and so many unpredictable things, and so much deceit built into the process, and such the type of bad behaviors or criminal behaviors that this gives room for is just endless.
And even so, when it's regulated. So one of the women who spoke was a woman who is in the UK. She had a child for her family member, and she had the most awful experience. And this is what is promoted in the UK as being the sort of friendship first, or the family model, where everything is lovely because it's done within a family, and it's almost like a light touch in terms of the sort of regulatory framework, if you like. Like, you wouldn't necessarily have to have an agency involved. You can also have what is called these independent journeys, where people are just matching on the internet, on Facebook usually. And for her situation, her name's Marianne, it's just the most appalling story. She still suffers with complex post-traumatic stress disorder over 10 years later. There's no mental health support that specializes in this area. In fact, when she goes to look for specialist support, she finds that she's guided towards support that's for commissioning parents. So there's nothing that's actually directed for her. It impacted her family enormously, her own children, her marriage. and she's not seen the child since birth.
Right. So she was promised contact and then they renegotiated, but also like a lot of coercive control and hijacking her life and
Absolutely.
an enormous amount of psychological, emotional abuse.
And that's within the so-called regulated side. And the thing that always makes me think as well about law reform proposals is, you can't legally force people to be friends. So another surrogate mother who hasn't been able to speak, she had a child for friends of hers. They were sort of like family friends. And that also went horribly wrong. It went through the courts. She was successful in the sense that the judge allows her to see her son several times a year and to have some contact. But this is a child who she's not only the birth mother, but actually in this situation, she is also the genetic mother, meaning that obviously she used her own egg to conceive. So that's called traditional surrogacy. And then gestational surrogacy is where there's an egg from someone else, and it may not even be the commissioning mother. There may not be a commissioning mother. It might be another woman who's given her egg. And those pregnancies are more risky because obviously it's foreign DNA being introduced into the mother's body. And then surrogacy is more risky anyway. So it's about 3 times the risk of severe pregnancy complications, including preeclampsia, postpartum hemorrhage, and postpartum sepsis.
Yeah.
There was a study that would summarize some of these things that we've known because there's studies on this from over the last decade. The authors of that study also did a separate study that was about mental health in surrogacy. And they found that a new onset mental health condition is more likely in surrogacy. Like you can't force legal friendships, but medically, statistically, through research, we know that you are at risk for your mental health and your physical health. And we should make laws based on evidence.
Yeah. And also the whole idea that you are making a woman into a commercial manufacturer of babies and the baby into a product. How do you think that's going to shape our relationship between these groups of people who are in this project together? Some is going to be a buyer and someone's going to be a seller of humans.
Yeah. So an egg provider or a womb provider, women being vessels, they're just the vessel. I mean, we are going backwards if we're really considering that to be sort of like a subset of women, a subclass of women who are used or useful for this reason. Right. The language is a real bugbear of mine. It's a huge thing because I think that's where the normalization comes in.
Absolutely. And I think it borrows a lot from prostitution and the way we speak about prostitution now. Sex work is work, and that there's an attempt to legitimize, this quote unquote autonomy that we're giving women to exploit themselves or to sell parts and pieces of themselves or the reproductive process. Like it's not very different from prostitution. I think of it as procreative prostitution.
So it's often, we've heard this phrase, reproductive work is work.
Right.
So it borrows from the sex work is work phrase. And you're absolutely right. The bodily autonomy argument comes up a lot. I think when you look at it as a woman using her body, that she supposedly has this freedom, she should have the freedom and the right to do this. That's ultimately the argument that comes from the other side. The difference, obviously, there's lots of differences, but one of the main ones is that in surrogacy, a brand new human being is a part of this form of work or chosen employment, if we're talking about it in those terms. And when we think of the sort of industrialization and using women, it's almost like a production line, in manufacturing.
It's a machine.
Say. Yeah. There's a book that I've come back to rereading called The Mother Machine by Gina Cora. She passed away fairly recently, and she coined the term junk liberty, which is a bit like referring to junk food, but sort of like saying you have this, this choice that isn't really a choice. Ultimately, if your options are limited, then you don't have choice. And I put it in very simple terms to sort of try to get that kind of comprehension where, if you go to the cereal aisle in a supermarket and there's, 100 different cereals to choose from. And then, you might have a situation, for example, like with Ukraine and the conflict and war there, food is limited. You can't go to the supermarket and see 100 different types of cereal. There might be one box left, and it might be 5 times the price as what it was pre-war. So, what are your options truly when they are limited? And we see very often, and we're seeing it more and more actually, this language of manufacturing. So, for example, talking about a shortage of women. There's not enough supply.
Right.
Stocks are low. These wombs are occupied and we need to have more vacant wombs. And it's really quite disturbing. And it's getting into very manipulative language, such as wombs without borders. We heard that.
God,
Wombs
no.
without borders and humanitarian surrogacy. There's reproductive privilege. So people who can have children without having to go through surrogacy, they are
Privileged somehow.
Fertility, yes. The other one I thought of was also reproductive refugees. So they are people who have to go abroad because it's too expensive in their own country to go and get a surrogate mother from there, just get a woman. And they need to go somewhere where it's cheaper, like Ukraine or Mexico or Colombia. They are fleeing in that refugee sense. And then the women should be providing from a humanitarian point of view. So we're moving into, I just think this is dystopian. Is there any other way to describe it?
Yeah, no, this is like the normalization of using women in this way is, I know it's a cliche, but Handmaid's Tale, first chapter. It feels like, we got somewhere with elevating women into some category of human, even if it's a subcategory. And now we're making a complete turnaround with this like lazy immorality that just kind of scratches the surface of the autonomy conversation and doesn't take into account all of the context in which women actually live and make decisions in our lives. Like the example you just mentioned with Ukraine, that there are men and women from our countries, US, UK, or whatever, who jump over the moral question of going to a war-torn country where women are in such desperate straits, and they have the amorality to commission these desperate women to become pregnant and go through the whole thing and manufacture a baby for them. Like, how do you, as a man, I get it, the exploitation has been going on for a long time, the way they look at women, but for women to turn around and do that and make that decision to other women is beyond what I can wrap my mind around, honestly.
It is, but then I think there is some element, it's hard to understand, but I think there is a desperation on the other side as well. So the desperation that occurs through having tried IVF, it not being successful, when a doctor who you have a relationship with, they've been walking with you for a long time and kind of like going through this experience with you and guiding you and advising you. And they may say, do you have a sister? Or do you have a cousin? Or, a female in your family who's probably younger than you, fertile, maybe they're not very busy. Would you, think about signing up to a surrogacy agency? And, there's agencies that partner with you, IVF clinics in the UK, and they may or may not be private equity owned, these clinics. This is something that is coming from doctors. And so it might be the first time that a very desperate couple who, they do want to be parents and they hear about this and they think, okay, so it must be quite normal and safe because a doctor is suggesting it.
Sure.
Then they go into this pipeline where everyone around them is saying, this is normal and possible, and there's
Everybody's
no harm.
doing it.
Everyone's doing it, and no one talks about the risks at all. So, there is that possibility that people enter into surrogacy conversations from a trusted source, and then it goes from there. And then if they don't hear anyone challenge them, like we would say, this is unethical, this is not safe, like, what does this mean for women in society? Having those conversations. I've had a couple of conversations just this week about how if a woman wants to do this, it's her choice, it's her body, her choice, etc. And one of them was with a man who, not sure he confessed to it, but he didn't have a problem, he said, with sex work is work. So if you also come from that perspective where there is a type of woman who can be used for somebody else's benefit, whether that's pleasure, whether that's for a baby to make their dreams come true, all of that kind of language around the advertising as well. You can understand why people think that way. It's never going to be okay, and I'm never going to agree with them, but you can try and understand, almost like you need to see where the other parties are coming from. Now, when it comes to deliberately going abroad to another country, I mean, obviously you're exploiting poor women in the UK as well. It's not like we don't have poverty in the UK. We do. But if you were going to Ukraine, where that there is a war taking place, and the advice from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office is not to travel, and we had the COVID lockdown, etc., and travel bans, people's morals do go out of the window when they want something really badly.
That's right. But I don't understand. I mean, you cannot look past the economics of this in any capacity. Like you said, wealthy women do not sign up for reproductive usage. And they are the commissioners, they are the people who are the buyers of these goods and services, these babies and the creation of them. And there's absolutely no question that poverty is the biggest employer here.
That's true. And that would definitely be the case both domestically and internationally. But I think there's also another layer to that. I mean, obviously from the surrogate mothers I've spoken to, it's not just money that is the motivator. It can be one of the motivators alongside other things, or it can be the main motivator. But there are some other elements to take into consideration. So, for example, the woman who I was talking about who had this kind of fraudulent situation with these Asian buyers, she has spoken to me about toxic empathy and, how she just wanted to help. Genuinely, like she just wanted to help. And the couple who were presented to her as sort of like VIPs, she understood that they were coming from the sort of one child policy government, and they wanted to have a second child. But by the time that happened and they were living in the US, that they had, obviously fertility issues, or the woman was older. It turned out this woman was pregnant later, she found out. But because it was all just a web of very complex lies, but she did just want to help. And she's like, well, I've been so blessed. I have these wonderful children, and it would be a win-win to have money. Her partner was in a court case situation. It was a custody with his children. So they needed money. She also wanted to help, and it can be both. And then it can be, as I was saying, for the woman who was from the UK, where she was helping a family member and she didn't have any payment involved. It was just the very most basic sort of pregnancy-related expenses, like maternity clothes. And so there can be motivations where there was another situation where this is quite a complicated one as well. So there was a son and a daughter, and the parents split up, and the son went with the mother and the daughter went with the father. And later in her life, in order to sort of ingratiate herself with her mother, she offered to be a surrogate mother for her brother. Her brother was in a homosexual relationship, and it was a way of having opportunities to speak to them, kind of offering herself, if you like, to sort of get back in their good graces. The child that was born, there's some secrecy around who that child is and what the kind of relationship is. I mean, all families are individual and complicated in different ways. And the same in friendships as well, I think, at times, particularly involving surrogacy. And so There is the money element, but it's not the only thing. And I think if we look at toxic femininity, as the woman who had the other court case as well, she spoke to me about toxic femininity. And then the lady from the States spoke to me about toxic empathy. And they can be very, very deeply rooted in being sort of like a people pleaser, wanting to have friends, being lonely. I did a review of a short BBC series that was called The Surrogates. I never use that language. I always say surrogate mothers. But in that, there was a situation where there was a woman who was a social worker, and she spoke about having low self-esteem and that she needed to prove to herself that she was a good person. I mean, that's quite an extreme view, to be thinking that you have to give somebody a baby in order to be a good person. Another woman in that series, she was in a same-sex relationship and she had had children and she wanted to pay it forward for the sort of LGBT community. So it's really complex. There's quite a few, there's a range of reasons. Money's always there. Money is always there, but it's definitely not the only thing.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I think a few things occur to me, like the power dynamics in families or any relationships are never neutral. And there are many ways that, aside from money or wealth, there are many ways that power can be exerted that has to do with where the power lies in the relationship. So I take your point. Absolutely.
There's one other example that I've just come into my mind. It's of a celebrity in Ireland. He was in Big Brother. That's how he became famous. And he was the only boy of, I think, about 5 or 6 children. And the youngest sister has now had 2 children for him because he's in a same-sex relationship and he's wanted to have a surrogate-born baby. And she's a single lady. She doesn't have any children, any other children. And she sort of moved in with them. And I don't know, I got a very strong sense of her wanting to do something for the family and just being the youngest. I think maybe with like the other siblings, they had children. I mean, so they couldn't be the one to be asked or the one to offer. But yeah, I can see that power dynamic. Like you say, there's always a power dynamic within families, even if we're not necessarily all that aware or conscious of it. You know, it's there.
Yeah, exactly. And the toxic femininity or toxic empathy you speak of, I think, is a much, much larger issue than maybe feminism in the broad realm is not addressing. The low self-esteem coupled with this, like, having to prove that you're a good person by not being selfish and to like self-sacrifice is something that lives in us, in all of us in some capacity. And I think it needs to be exorcised. I really do.
It's something that we may not even be all that aware of when we have acts of helping others. I mean, sort of like obviously it's not a bad thing to help other people, but I think the sort of like be kind and the sort of this self-sacrificing nature of even around donating your eggs, if donation is the word that we use in this context. So in that BBC documentary series, there was a young woman, she was a single mother, and she spoke about not using her eggs. So these eggs every month are going to waste. And I thought that was such an interesting concept of a period, as in like, I have something of value that is naturally exiting my body. You know, the egg hasn't been fertilized. I'm not really using it. Like we should catch the egg and like we're wasting it if we flush it down the toilet, essentially. And I just hadn't really thought about it in those terms. And she was talking about it like this was something that was understood possibly within sort of like her age group or her social groups. And I thought, what a strange thing to say or to think. And that's because it's valuable to somebody else. So that whole fertility privilege, or aren't you lucky you can do this and you don't need any help and you don't have to pay for it and you don't have to go to an IVF clinic. Oh, and I'm so lucky to have it all by myself. And I really should help other people who don't have the same luck as me.
Yeah.
This is a natural occurrence. I mean, women, girls, definitely didn't ask for periods. We didn't ask for this to be bestowed upon us. We didn't ask for this to be the process of reproduction, that we were the ones who were doing it or that we were the ones who shed our womb lining every month. It's not something that we do for fun. And yet we're really lucky. It was just it really struck me. And that's definitely happening, I think, in younger circles of women.
Yeah, and the fact that they're being conditioned to think of themselves as kind of like a reproductive resource for others.
To be mined.
Yeah, to be mined, not something that is distinct to you and your, I mean, I think of any individual women as part of a mother tree. Your mitochondrial DNA is part of humanity's mother tree. And to consider that this like cheap resource for anyone to mine is just so offensive to me.
So it's actually been probably more prominent just this week with the announcement from singer Meghan Trainor.
Oh, yeah, that made a splash.
Yeah. So interestingly, I think the backlash to that now is much bigger than Lily Collins was with her announcement of the baby that she got through surrogacy from another woman. And that was about a year ago. It was big then, but this is bigger, I think, at least for what I've seen from my particular corner of the internet. So there's obviously the dehumanization, but there's also this sort of, well, she's not the mother because it's not her egg. And you think, well,
Right.
The woman who gives birth is a mother.
And built the baby with her body.
Yeah. And so within that, there's obviously epigenetics, which is the sort of switching on or switching off of features, if you like, from the DNA as a result of that particular pregnancy. So that would be related to the woman who is actually pregnant. And then, as you say, you've got the mitochondrial DNA and it's called fetal maternal microchimerism, which is the cell swap. It's infinitesimal, so it wouldn't show up on a DNA test. It's not DNA, it's a different type of DNA. And I, for example, I have an older sibling. So because some of her cells were in my mother, some of her cells are actually in me, like tiny, tiny, tiny. And it doesn't really count for anything, but it does.
Well, we don't know that.
Well, we don't know that because we don't have the study, but we know that this is as a result of a symbiotic natural occurrence, which is the mother-baby bond. So it can't occur any other way. And it's so readily dismissed when the stories about Meghan Trainor or Lily Collins say, well, she's not the mother and Meghan Trainor is the mother because she provided the egg. Well, no, because she didn't give birth. So there isn't that relationship that's already been established. And the calcium from her teeth didn't get withdrawn to build a skeleton. And, the baby didn't hear her heartbeat. She heard this other woman's heartbeat. If we said it was that way, to play devil's advocate, we agree with that argument for a moment. What then happens with egg donation?
Right.
If motherhood is established from the egg, the woman who provides the egg, then egg donors, women who have donated their eggs from all over the world, are now mothers because that's how the relationship is established. If we're talking about the biological connection, I would say the biological connection is birth. So birth is biological and you have a birth mother in adoption and you have a birth mother in surrogacy, only we call that woman a surrogate mother. But we have a genetic mother that could be somebody else because of the method of conception and where that egg was obtained from, a different woman or the commissioning mother. And that has all occurred because of IVF. So I think in Meghan Trainor's Instagram post, she said, I think she said something like, this is as a result of love, trust, and science. Yes, it is as a result of science, that's for sure, because it wouldn't have been possible without it. But I don't think that was the original intention of the geneticists and the original development of IVF. It was actually just between a couple, and it wasn't to overstimulate the ovaries to such a degree to get so many eggs. It was just one egg, for example. But
once down that road.
Yeah. So they started it not necessarily with the intentions of where we've ended up. It is a scary and worrying place of what we're looking at, down the barrel of a gun, really, for the future. But you can't have it where a motherhood is established by the provision of an egg in whatever form, and for that not to apply to other situations. You basically can't have it both ways.
Absolutely. And another thing I think that was so offensive about the Meghan Trainor announcement was that, she posted a photo of herself naked and crying with the baby on skin to skin in a hospital setting. And this is complete theater where, she had nothing to do with the birth. She just got to the hospital, took her clothes off, cried over the baby, and then took a picture. And the sort of disappearing of the birthing mother is just so, even if you don't think deeply politically about it, it is just such a visceral, for me at any rate, visceral offense.
I agree. It's actually quite a common trend, I think, for commissioning parents or baby buyers or whatever you want to call them, to have that performative photo. I've seen it a lot. And men do it. And, again, the argument was, well, men do it and it's beneficial for bonding with a child. It's actually not. It's actually beneficial for the father, yes. There's studies on that, I think, where it says the men have said, they felt quite calm and protective, etc. And these were positive feelings. But in terms of the baby and also the mother, the actual mother, for the mother, skin to skin is quite good for contracting the uterus to expel a placenta. It restricts blood flow, I understand. So with those contractions, so there's a lower risk of hemorrhaging, postpartum hemorrhage, obviously, as we understand to be one of the risks of surrogacy. But the studies on this for the baby, so they are obviously calmer. They have the heartbeat. It's good for neural development. There's lots of benefits to the mother and the baby being together. And then the benefits of somebody else doing it and that person not being the mother, that would benefit them. It doesn't benefit the baby. So it is performative, as you say, theatre.
And it doesn't benefit them either in any sense because they don't have a uterus that's contracting. They don't have they don't have the need.
There's no placenta to be expelled. No.
Right. So it's like it's performative to the nth degree.
Somebody's always ready with a camera.
Yeah. Exactly.
There's always someone ready with a camera, whether that's their partner or midwife, I don't know. But the woman who, lies bleeding in the next room, or she is disappeared, as you say. And I wrote an article in The Critic that was about these two court cases that relate to Nigeria. So it's really actually an expectation in some countries with surrogacy agencies that the commissioning parents do not meet the surrogate mother. They don't know her name. Or they might just know her first name, but it's quite common not to know anything about her. The agency will do the medical checks and things like that. And then the commissioning parents will just be told, this one's all right to go ahead with.
So like creating another layer, going abroad, another layer of anonymizing and disappearing the mother. Yeah. So go on, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. And so these two court cases, so basically there were two separate couples. They went to Nigeria and they actually went to the same clinic, which I thought was interesting. And that clinic, they obviously had anonymized the surrogate mothers. And subsequently, when it comes to obtaining a parental order, which secures your parental rights in the UK, you do need a signature from the surrogate mother. And then it's quite important to know who she is and where she is and if she's available to sign a piece of paper, or speak to a court reporter to establish that she has freely given her consent, etc. Now, this clinic just didn't want to cooperate with the family courts here in the UK, and it caused a lot of issues. And the surrogate mother, I was actually speaking with her yesterday in Nigeria, and she was explaining to me, her story is just awful. It's just so awful. She is literally just a body. She carries something within her that's very valuable, but her life and her health and her well-being and pretty much anything to do with her, including her name, is just irrelevant information. As long as she's looking after herself during the pregnancy, once we're done, off you go.
I just want to read something that you wrote that just struck me so much. This is the parents who are talking to us. At that point, we are satisfied that opting for an anonymous surrogacy will be our best option since we will not meet the surrogate mother and she will not know us. We thought this will remove all the problems people face when they do surrogacy and the stigma that surrounds it. We want safety, protection, security, and peace of mind. We didn't want unnecessary involvement and attachment. We just want to sign the contract without owing anybody obligation. We understand someone to do this is really giving us something special. We don't want to carry this for the rest of our lives. Identifying the person will make us think we owe them gratitude for the rest of our lives. And that's what they want to avoid by having a Nigerian agency where they'll never meet the mother. I find this horrifying impulse that you are getting a baby, a live human being, from from someone who you do not want to know and do not want to feel any gratitude or obligation towards. What do we even call that? That sounds like very inhuman.
I mean, this is what I mean when the morals go out the window. You know, there isn't any way to make it ethical. And I think that statement came from, they submitted a statement to the court when they were looking to get their parental order. And I pulled that from the court notes and included that in the article because I found that striking as well. I thought it laid bare what their intentions were, why they chose Nigeria. I mean, they had family roots in Nigeria, and you know what they knew Nigerian agencies could give them.
The object seems to be, the absolute purpose seems to be to remove the mother, period. To remove the role of the mother, to disappear the mother out of the picture, to pretend like that mothers aren't central to the making of a family or making of life.
I mean, that was definitely the case with the court case that actually went all the way to, I think it was the Court of Appeal. The two men who had obtained a child through the surrogate mother that we know, they said that he doesn't have a mother. The little boy doesn't have a mother. You know, the mother doesn't exist. And I've seen that just this week in a social media post. You know, there is no mother. There definitely is. There absolutely definitely is. It might be that you don't want to acknowledge that you want to pretend that she doesn't exist, but there is no person alive on the planet now or before who existed without a mother, because it isn't actually possible. So when we talk about science, like, this is the thing, they're so quick, like you say, to disappear the mother, to make her invisible, to take her out of the picture and pretend she doesn't matter. I mean, she might matter to the child. That might matter. So, you know, you might raise that child and tell that child that the mother doesn't matter, but they still might matter in the same way with adoption.
You can try to sever the bond any way you like, but like, it's never not going to be central to humanity. And the horrendous language that's being used to minimize the role of the mother, that she's an oven for the bun or the vessel, like you mentioned before. And
can I tell you my favorite one?
Yeah.
Extreme babysitting, that's the one. Extreme babysitting. Oh, yeah. That's my favorite one, I think, because it's just so obtuse, isn't it? I used to babysit when I was a teenager and get a little bit of money and sit in someone's house next door to ours, and like it's a job, so I'm just, you know, looking after someone's child in my body, and I'm just going about my everyday business whilst babysitting this embryo that's growing into a fetus, that's, you know, growing into a baby and will one day be born. Like, that's a very, this manipulative downgrading, downplaying of something that's very real. It just goes to show that they can't actually, they have to have these disguises in language because it's built on sand.
Right, to be able to sell the idea at all that the mother is so trivial, unimportant.
These euphemisms and this euphemistic smoke and mirrors kind of language, it's just because it can't live out in the open, which is what I hope to do, obviously, is to shine a light on what the reality is so that people can see it for themselves.
Which is such important work. I'm, like a lot of things, I'm waiting for some kind of tipping point. You know, someone says something in just the right way, or the attitudes kind of turn. I'm looking at Italy. Italy has now made it completely criminal on every level to commission inside, outside Italy, and they have forbidden Italians to go abroad. What do you think? What are the most effective means? Like, what can we do? What can countries do? What can individuals do?
I think individuals can learn for themselves, obviously, as I say, like what the truth is, so one sort of pillar of my campaign is, to think critically, ask more questions and think more deeply, of anyone who sort of says, oh, I know somebody who was a surrogate. I always say, well, how much was she paid and what was her circumstances and did she have any issues? Sort of ask questions, because if it is something that people are genuinely willing to talk about, then we can talk about all of it. There shouldn't be anything that's hidden. That's kind of what the other side would say, I think, was to say, like, we're all being honest and open about it. So, okay, let's be really honest and talk about the dollars, and talk about the pounds and the euros, right? Certainly another thing that we aim to do is to get, obviously stories in the media and to get coverage of surrogacy, not just the, fluffy, oh, this celebrity here's had a baby through surrogacy, like this invisible conduit, this invisible woman. So I think, that has definitely improved in the last 18 months to 2 years, perhaps. There's more interest from journalists. There's more general awareness. And I think that people generally become more and more aware over time. If people are in the UK, they can send letters to their MPs. They can go to Surrogacy Concerns website, because there's 2 letters there. There's 3 letters. So they can look on the Take Action and send letters to their MPs about the donation of eggs or the harvesting of eggs, surrogacy in the UK, and the law reform proposals, and also with international surrogacy, because we do obviously still allow this kind of like trade route through from other countries to the UK for importing babies. Really, that's kind of what it comes down to, the trafficking of newborns. So there's that. And then I think, in terms of countries, there's obviously different laws. Lots of countries ban it already. And as you speak of Italy, like that was a ban that was in place for about 20 years. And then what happened was that they criminalized it. So it was an extension to an existing law. It's just that no one really paid any attention to the existing law. And so the government obviously wanted to solidify and bring in kind of large fines and I think imprisonment as consequences to breaking the law. It was framed very much as an anti-LGB law, but it was in place for quite a long time beforehand. So I think, there's some subversive manipulation of language, really, or just kind of trying to disguise it in a way that isn't necessarily true, because it obviously affects heterosexual people as well. The law in Italy applies to everybody. It's not just for a particular section or cohort of people, of adults. I think countries can look at their own laws and kind of even like decide what they consider a mother to be, like whether a woman who is a mother has any sort of legal rights, whether the children have any legal rights once they're born, because they do, because we have human rights. And they are humans, they're human beings. So there's the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. There's obviously international human rights law, and then domestic or national government human rights law. Like if there's lobbying groups for people who are trying to change the laws, like for example, in Nigeria, there is a politician who is a commissioning father. So he's brought a bill to change it. I think the same happened in Rwanda, and then Kenya have a law actually that's been passed by the lower house, but it's going to the upper house. The deadline actually was today to send in submissions and for the consultation on that. But when governments, or they're looking at surrogacy laws, or they're being lobbied to relax the laws or to bring in regulation that makes it all safe, they've got to speak to surrogate mothers. And they've got to look at the implications of the law, that they're actually in the clauses, like the details. For example, in Ireland, they passed the law by guillotine last year. So that means they just pushed it through really quickly. And there was a proposal to ensure that sex offenders couldn't apply. And that was voted down. So the idea is that this kind of ethics board will review applications. But that would be quite a simple one, I think, to say no to. So people, men or women, but it's mostly men statistically, in terms of sexual violent crime, they shouldn't have a child that they obtain through surrogacy, in the same way that adoption would prevent that from happening if you have a conviction.
Right.
because of the safeguarding risks, right? So like they need to look at safeguarding, they need to look at what it really means for women, the risks, the harms for the children and the women. And then really, what does it mean in your society if you're saying there is a subclass of women who can be used for this purpose? What does that say about your society? What does that say about your country and what you're willing to do to your own citizens?
Exactly.
It really is quite serious because it's happening a lot everywhere. And we hear it all the time of countries pursuing this, country governments. And it's seen as this progressive, like people just want to be parents and it's an alternative pathway to parenthood. And again, all this language, we've got to start using our brains and really thinking about what this means because it is at the cost of women. It's on the back of their bodies, literally off their uteruses, off their wombs, off their bones and their brains.
You write about women who go through many, many surrogacies, and it becomes kind of a lifestyle or a full-time occupation.
A lifestyle choice, right? With that body autonomy, you can choose. And there's also what I would call, so there's sort of like a egg donation to surrogate mother pipeline. And then there's a step forward, which would be to work in a surrogacy agency. So after donating your eggs and then going a step further and having a baby for somebody else. And then sometimes women set up their own agencies. Sometimes they will join an existing agency. They may work in the coordination side where they're working with the surrogate mothers or they're working with the commissioning parents. They're kind of experts because they've been through it themselves. And I would have significant concerns about whether women who are in those positions are sharing the details about the risks and the harms with potential surrogate mothers who are kind of coming onto their books, if you like coming through their doors.
That they're trying to recruit.
Yeah. I mean, the UK's first known surrogate mother is called Kim Cotton, and there's a YouTube clip that I share sometimes of her on a daytime TV program called Lorraine, and it's sort of like an early morning show. And she was on essentially to say that she was back working at COTS, which is the Childlessness Overcome Through Surrogacy. It's the UK's first agency. And she was talking about recruiting women, stay-at-home mothers. It's a way of staying at home with your children for longer. You can help somebody. It's such a lovely thing to do. And she said that she had kind of come out of retirement or something to go back to COTS to recruit. And she was actively, advertising on this TV interview to say women can do this. And, there are some pretty effective advertising campaigns to get women to donate their eggs. I mean, we've seen this at universities, adverts at bus stops, things in freshers packs, when they join the university for the young women who are about to enter into like quite a lot of debt in order to secure their education. It's very predatory.
And I think also, there's a seduction process to make women or manipulate women to feel good about what they're doing. And I think everyone is in on that. The doctors, the nurses, the recruiters, and not least of all, the intended parents. They have, they romance.
They do.
The woman in a sense.
They do. There could be some love bombing involved. There can be some taking care of her. I mean, I think particularly I think if you're a single mother, this woman who was in this documentary series and she was a single mother, she actually spoke about being suicidal. And she seemed to be, from my point of view, looking to extend her family in some way. Obviously, the father of her son was absent, no longer in their lives. And I think she saw these two men that she had this baby for as like being able to like lock on to new, and they're going to be like really best friends. They're going to be really, really good friends. I mean, I sort of guessed at that she would do it again. She would give these men a sibling for their child because it was her egg. So they would want to probably have that same genetic, so that the two children are bonded in that way. And there was a lot of things that she said that were really worrying. And I think that the advertising and the language that's used, it's this glorification of surrogacy. You're giving this amazing gift, this gift that you're bestowing upon these people that just can't do it without your help.
So you feel crucial, you feel
You're
needed.
really important. Yeah, you're really important. And they come around to your house, they'll look after your children, they'll cook for you, they will bring you gifts, they might take you out. You might go out for sort of like a family day out or something like that. Even in what they call the get to know period, this get to know period that we have talked about in the UK before you implant or before you use artificial insemination at home. You are sort of meant to becoming friends, and they'll say, oh, we get on so well. And you think, but you're doing it for a purpose. Like, I don't have any friendships in my life that I'm doing it for a particular reason to get something. I'm just friends with them because I like them, and I think they're friends with me because they like me back, and we have fun when we meet up or we go out for dinner or whatever. It's not for a purpose. It's not for me to get something out of them or for them to get something out of me. I mean, I don't think that can be friendship. I think you might get along with them, but I don't think that's friendship. It's not genuine.
No, it's usury. It's usury.
Yeah. And those friendships can then dissolve because once you've had the baby, what's the point? They're not going to be all that interested in making sure that her health is okay. And that, unless, of course, they want her to do it again. And that was the case, I think, with the woman in the US who was she was approached to do another contract, basically after this horrible experience that she'd been through. Well, come and have a second go and it will wash away all those horrible memories. And that is something that happens because women do have these bad experiences and they'll do it again, almost to finish on a good note, I think. There's a lot of psychology rooted in this, how you view your identity in your fertility and your purpose in your body. And if it doesn't work out, or if you don't stay friends and you can't build that relationship and see that child, well, then you can do it again.
Try for a better outcome.
To like wash away, to sort of place something positive on top of something negative to sort of justify and allow you to let go, and then to do it all over again with the same risks of the medical side, the same risks of it all going wrong, etc. And then it can be never ending. Like, what happens if that is your life and then you like all women get to an age where that's no longer possible? If that's your identity, where do you go from there?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, if you have a lot of babies for a lot of different people, are you going to maintain all of those relationships?
Exactly.
Are your kids going to know who they are? Is it this blending of families, or is it this transactional thing that actually just dissipates when everybody has got what they wanted? And maybe the surrogate mother is the one who's left behind. That's before you even get to the children who are being born.
Absolutely. And not to mention that in war-torn countries or countries where law is really weak, or where regulations are really weak, or women's rights are really weak, what we're seeing, and you can speak more about this, I'm sure, that, you have baby manufacturing plants, essentially, or where, whole cohorts of poor women are coerced into surrogate pregnancies. I mean, it's really kind of horrid.
It is. And we've, the human trafficking, I did a blog about last year, and it was looking at the regularity of news stories that are appearing about human trafficking and surrogacy, and it's increasing. I've been doing this for a long time. I see the stories when they come through, and it's just happening more and more. I mean, there was quite a significant one in Arcadia and California in the US. There was one in Georgia recently. Like, there really is no limit to it. That's the thing. And, whether it's one woman or 100 women, like, does it matter? If it's one woman who's been exploited, commodified, trafficked, she's lost her body autonomy, she's lost, she doesn't have her passport because it's been taken from her. She can't leave. She can't get away. She's trapped. Does it matter if it's one, or does it matter if it's 100? I think it matters if it's just one.
Absolutely.
I'm not willing to sacrifice one woman to this, and other people are. So I think the thing is that if we have to care about the one woman.
We have to care about every individual woman.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they are individuals. They're not machines. They're not baby-making robots.
Yeah.
They're human beings. And we have enough difficulty as it is with women's rights being recognised and women being recognised as human. And this is a step too far for me.
And going backwards. just sliding backwards.
And I wanted to talk about some of the science as well, because we spoke about that before. And I think one of the things about this sort of like invisibilization or the disappearing of the women, there was a scientific story about mice embryos being made from stem cells that are from men. And, you know, you'll read these stories and it's like this incredible scientific development, this innovative, groundbreaking, surging forward in life and science, you know, what we can do as the clever brains that can. And quite low down in the articles was the mention of the fact that it was a female mouse who gave birth to the mice pups, as they're called. So the baby mice, they have a mother, actually. So it might be that the stem cells were made from men's skin, or, you know, the cells were taken and grown and made into these embryo mice. But there was also a mother there too. So like you can say that
try as you might. Yeah, try as you might.
Try as you might. There's a female somewhere, and she's ultimately responsible for the birth of whether it's a mouse or whether it's a human baby. The idea that this technology will advance for that to apply to humans, there are experts who say that's possible, and maybe it is in the next 10 years, I don't know. That's not a life I look forward to. That's not a world or a society I look forward to where we are growing humans from skin cells, or we're doing womb transplants, or we're genetically editing embryos for eye colour, or I have lots of reservations about where the science is going, and we already have enough problems with the surrogacy law and what laws are coming and what people are trying to do to expand it and normalize it, as I say. So we don't need anything more to deal with, put it that way.
No, and we have just established some very, very slim rights for women. We don't need to have man again play God and marginalizing women or pretending like they're not central to life is not boding well for women.
Absolutely.
In terms of maintaining the slim rights we've fought so hard to get.
Yeah, so we've just had this window, and it definitely feels like we're going backwards if we're going to be reduced to vessels or useful storage units, extreme babysitters, and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the conversation and for talking to me about all of this kind of grisly stuff.
I'm not the bearer of good news, am I? I'm afraid it is concerning and disturbing, and that's one of my main motivators, is that I do want people to learn and think and understand what it really is, because it sounds like something that's actually pretty harmless, but it truly isn't. Far from it. Yeah. And all we can do is keep on talking and keep on raising awareness, so that we can move forward with those slim rights that we achieved, and that we can keep recognizing women as human.
Thank you for listening to Subject to Power. You can find the show online at subjecttopower.com or subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcasts. I'd love to know your thoughts on these conversations, so please drop a note on the website or find us on social media. The best way to support the show is to rate and review Subject to Power on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other listeners find us. Subject to Power is written, hosted, and produced by me, El Kamihira. Audio engineering is done by Jason Sheasley at Abridged Audio. Cover art by B. Johnson, and music by Beware of Darkness.